Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most truly transformative moments in human history. We are going to break down Maulana Maududi's incredibly rich historical and textual analysis of Surah Al-Anfal, which is a pivotal chapter of the Quran. But listen, we aren't just looking at an old historical text today. We're essentially examining the literal blueprint for an entirely new social order, one that rose straight out of the harsh chaos of the Arabian desert. It's a fascinating, brilliant study of survival, high-stakes strategy, and statecraft.
To really wrap our heads around the profound verses of this chapter, we first have to ask what seems like an impossible question. How on earth did a heavily outnumbered group of exiles actually change the course of history? Like, how did this small, displaced community manage to survive an absolute, looming existential threat? Because make no mistake, this wasn't just some minor skirmish out in the sand. This was a desperate, back-to-the-wall fight for their very right to exist in an incredibly unforgiving environment.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, the road to Medina. Second, the Quraysh trade route. Third, the Battle of Badr. Fourth, defining the spoils. And finally, divine intervention and morality.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the road to Medina. The source text emphasizes a really critical reality right off the bat. These exiles, they weren't just panicked refugees fleeing into the night. Following 13 years of brutal, systematic persecution in Mecca, they made a highly calculated migration. But man, the cost was staggering. They literally walked away from their homes, their established businesses, and generations of accumulated wealth. Basically, this sacrifice stripped them of all worldly status and societal protection. Yet, losing absolutely everything material kind of forced them to rely entirely on their faith and on each other. It forged this incredibly disciplined, tight-knit group whose resilience had been pressure-tested against unbelievable hostility.
This intense buildup spanned 13 grueling years of suffering in Mecca, which ultimately culminated in year 1 after Hijrah. That's the Arabic term for their Great Migration. But actually, seeking asylum in the city of Medina didn't just suddenly mean they were safe. Not at all. The threat from their former oppressors back in Mecca loomed larger and more aggressive than ever before. So by year 2, they were forced to rapidly build a defensive state apparatus. They had to systematically forge these complex, really fragile alliances with neighboring desert tribes, honestly, just to ensure their basic day-to-day survival while practically living under siege.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Quraysh trade route. If you want to pressure a hostile, aggressive superpower, military might usually isn't your first option, right? You go after their wallet. The geopolitical reality of the time was completely dictated by geography and commerce. The Meccan Quraysh, the ruling elite, relied almost entirely on this sprawling trade route winding right along the Red Sea coast. That coastal artery was what continuously pumped vast wealth, influence, and regional power directly into Mecca. So intercepting that specific trade route wasn't just some random act of desert banditry. It was a pure strategic necessity for the newly established Muslim community. It was literally the only tangible leverage they had to apply crippling pressure to their oppressors.
Well, this aggressive economic strategy quickly brought everything to a boiling point. The prominent Meccan leader, Abu Sufyan, was guiding an extraordinarily wealthy caravan along this vulnerable coastal route. Catching wind of the Muslim community's presence and the potential threat, he sent a desperate, urgent call for help back to Mecca. And this call sparked absolute panic, but more importantly, it inflamed the pride of the Meccan elite. The result? A massive military mobilization driven heavily by ego. They didn't just send a few guards to protect the caravan. No, they deployed a fully equipped professional army with a very clear desire to make a terrifying public spectacle out of crushing the Muslims forever.
All of this sets the stage perfectly for Section 3, the Battle of Badr.
The geographical strategy implemented here was an incredibly high-stakes gamble. The Muslim forces initiated this dramatic, rapid march out from Medina, pushing hard down to the wells of Badr. Now, in the harsh reality of desert warfare, securing water is quite literally the difference between life and death. By making this rapid tactical push, they secured the crucial water source before the massive Meccan army could even arrive. It was a brilliant maneuver. It fundamentally forced the heavily armed enemy to fight on the Muslims' terms, all while the Meccan soldiers were incredibly thirsty and exhausted from their own march.
But even with that brilliant tactical advantage, the odds were still utterly terrifying. The source text details a staggering mismatch in pure military strength. Just think about the math for a second. 313 early Muslims, practically unarmored, sharing just 2 horses and 70 camels among the entire group. Facing them, a disciplined force of 1,000 Meccan soldiers, heavily armored, boasting a formidable cavalry of 100 war horses.
To any military tactician of the time, this matchup was completely absurd. Logically, on paper, this should have been nothing short of an absolute massacre.
Yet, against every conceivable military odds, the Muslims secured a staggering, historically decisive victory. And the turning point of this entire conflict is perfectly captured by the number 70. Exactly 70 elite Quraysh leaders, the primary commanders of the opposition, fell as casualties, and another 70 were taken directly as prisoners of war. Think about that. The very architects of the cruel 13-year persecution were suddenly dramatically defeated by the exact same people they had stripped of wealth and exiled into the desert. The shockwave this single battle sent across the entire Arabian Peninsula is almost unimaginable.
Now, moving to Section 4, defining the spoils.
Because what happens right after an unexpected, massive victory is often where a society's true character is ultimately forged. The chapter actually gets its name from this precise historical moment. Anfal literally translates to bounties or spoils of war, but Surah Al-Anfal radically redefines this entire concept. In the context of ancient tribal warfare, a victory typically meant a chaotic free-for-all plundering, right? Just violently feeding personal greed and inflating tribal ego. But the text completely disrupts this by removing the spoils from individual ownership, placing them firmly and exclusively under the authority of the state. It represents a massive paradigm shift from unchecked greed to rigorous discipline and state-managed resource distribution.
Imagine the pure adrenaline coursing through the ranks right after this seemingly impossible victory. Ego-driven disputes over who fought the hardest or who deserved the most loot were practically inevitable. But the very first verse of the chapter drops like a heavy hammer on human ego. Quote, "They ask you about the bounties. Say, the bounties belong to Allah and the Messenger." This crucial opening immediately dismantled any brewing arguments. It forcefully reinforced a vital spiritual truth to the soldiers. The victory itself and all its subsequent material rewards were granted exclusively by divine will, not by any individual's personal combat prowess.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Divine Intervention and Morality.
Here we explore exactly how Surah Al-Anfal takes the raw, unchecked emotion of a monumental battlefield victory and masterfully uses it to codify the spiritual and legal bedrock of an entirely new civilization. Instead of lavishing praise on their impressive sword skills or tactical brilliance, the verses immediately pivot to clearly define the fundamental characteristics of true believers. The text explicitly calls for trembling hearts whenever the divine is mentioned. It demands a constantly growing faith, steadfast dedication to prayer, and selfless charitable spending. Maulana Maududi's commentary highlights these very specific traits to continuously remind the victors that genuine internal purity, profound humility, and a strict reliance on a higher moral order matter infinitely more than any fleeting bloody glory found on a battlefield.
And to absolutely ensure that the community didn't succumb to dangerous arrogance, the text explicitly pulls back the curtain on the unseen reality of the battle they just fought. It directly reminds the believers that their miraculous triumph against a heavily armored force 3 times their size was a direct, undeniable result of divine intervention. 1,000 angels were sent down. But here's the interesting part. They weren't just deployed as a military reinforcement. The text describes them as a glad tiding. They were vital psychological support, sent specifically to stabilize the trembling human hearts of an incredibly small force facing utterly terrifying odds.
But the really deep analysis of this text reveals that Surah Al-Anfal is intensely practical, serving as much more than just spiritual reflection. It established groundbreaking, humane rules of engagement for armed conflict. It mandated the strictly ethical, merciful treatment of prisoners of war, which, by the way, was a radical concept that was almost entirely unheard of in the harsh reality of 7th century Arabia. It declared the absolute, unbreakable sanctity of international treaties. Maududi notes that these specific verses effectively formed the robust constitutional backbone of a highly disciplined, deeply ethical Islamic state, designed specifically to eradicate the deep-rooted corruption and chaotic, bloody tribalism of the past.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a profound thought. The Battle of Badr was fought in the scorching desert over 1,400 years ago, yet the core lessons woven throughout Surah Al-Anfal remain astonishingly timeless. So how can these ancient principles of ultimate, unwavering discipline, of intentionally shifting our focus away from selfish short-term material gain toward profound spiritual integrity actually transform the seemingly impossible, overwhelming battles we consistently face in our own modern lives today? It's definitely something to think deeply about. Thanks so much for joining us.